Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here for Virginia United Land Trust Virtual Land Conservation and Greenways Conference. My name is Sarah Sanford, and I will be presenting virtually today. Please keep in mind this is a pre-recorded presentation, so live questions will not be possible today, although I will include my contact information at the end. So if you do have questions, I hope you will reach out. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Using Greenways to Combat Climate Change. Again, my name is Sarah Sanford. I am the Virginia and North Carolina coordinator for the East Coast Greenway Alliance, based in Durham, North Carolina, but I cover both Virginia and North Carolina. I think usually I'd have someone introducing me at a live conference, but since we're virtual, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I am originally from Virginia, so excited to be part of this and talking with you all today. I grew up in Fredericksburg, went to college at William & Mary, and lived in Richmond for a while before I moved down to North Carolina to start graduate school. So my background is mainly in the environmental field, and then of course bike and pedestrian type stuff since I'm with the Greenway Alliance. So excited to talk to you all today about both climate change and greenways, and to be with such a great group. So what I'll do with this virtual presentation is that since you're not able to ask questions or take notes the way you usually would during a live presentation, I'll try to pause for a few seconds at the end of each slide. So if you do want to take notes or screenshot something or write down a question, you can. And again, I will share my contact info at the end. So just feel free to email me if you have any questions or would like to engage further. So we'll go ahead and get started. Using greenways to combat climate change. And I'm going to start off the presentation with a few photos from different parts of Virginia over the past couple years. So this first one was taken in Henrico, Virginia, back in May of 2018. This one's from Virginia Beach in 2019, two different restaurants, one of which had raised the foundation of their building before Hurricane Dorian, the other hadn't. And this photo is from the Blue Ridge Parkway near Roanoke in May of this year. And a couple news headlines from the past couple years. This first one from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, wettest year on record. 2018 was the wettest year on record for dozens of towns and cities in Virginia. And this next one is from actually just last week, July 17th of 2020. Triple-digit heat threatens DC as dangerous conditions are set to envelop the mid-Atlantic. These last few headlines, the Atlantic hurricane season is off to a record fast start and is likely to get worse. With above average season expected, state hurricane planning continues despite pandemic. So I'm highlighting the words record and above average here because we're seeing those words in many of our weather headlines these days. Record high temperatures, record rainfall, record number of storms. So the question is, are all these weather events that have happened over the past several years actually historic? Are they actually extreme? And the answer is yes, extreme weather is on the rise. You can see from this figure here that shows flood, storm, and drought data that especially over the past decade or so, extreme weather events are happening much more frequently. And as this figure shows, extreme global heat as well as other extreme global weather patterns can't be explained by natural variability alone. Human influences have indeed had an impact on our climate, which in turn impacts weather. And this is a figure that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but because this presentation focuses so much on greenhouse gases, just a quick reminder to put greenhouse gases in context. Climate change, as most of us know, is driven by greenhouse gases and the trapping of those greenhouse gases within the Earth's atmosphere. So just a quick reminder of the science before we go further. And speaking of science, one thing that science has showed us is that climate change contributes to increases in the severity, the frequency, and the duration of extreme weather events. So essentially, because of climate change, storms and other extreme weather events are more damaging, they are occurring more often, and they are lasting longer. And before we go further, just to distinguish weather and climate. So again, climate is the longer term patterns, and then weather is shorter term. So we're at a point with the climate science where we can actually attribute individual events to human-induced climate change, like the European heat wave of 2003, for example. Humans were able to nail down the fact that there were noticeable human contributions to the change in weather patterns that summer in 2003. On a similar note, there was a study done in 2013 that looked specifically at Hurricane Sandy, which, if you remember, happened in 2012. And this study looked at sea level rise impacts in the mid-Atlantic. And what was really interesting about this study is that they looked at tide gauges. So the x-axis in this graph is years, the y-axis is the tide gauges in millimeters above average. And what this paper showed by looking at these tide gauges was that Hurricane Sandy flooded an area about 27 square miles larger than it would have if the storm had hit back in the 1800s before this level of human-caused climate change was occurring. And that's because human-caused climate change has caused global mean sea levels to rise by about 8 inches. So that doesn't sound like a lot when you're thinking about the ocean, but it is a lot when you think about coastlines and coastal development and extreme weather events like hurricanes and what they can do to tides. So where are all these greenhouse gases that cause climate change coming from? They have to get in our atmosphere somehow. And one of the big answers is the transportation sector. So when we look at total greenhouse gas emissions across the United States by sector, what we see is that the transportation sector is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gases nationwide. Electricity obviously is also in the mix, along with industry, commercial and residential, and agriculture. But climate change, one of the huge drivers is emissions from the transportation sector. And this is data from the EPA, by the way. And what's interesting is that transportation is doing this slow climb into first place. So you can see here Electricity has been the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US for quite a while, whereas transportation has this slow and steady rise into first place as people are driving more, flying more, we're transporting more goods. And so we know that transportation has been the top source of greenhouse gases for a while now. What's interesting is that the vast majority of these emissions come from driving. You might think it would be planes. We're always being told not to fly because of the carbon footprint, but trains, planes, ships, it's actually driving that is the vast majority of the emissions. And when we look at data for Virginia, the story is the same. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Virginia. Um, I took this photo from my hometown newspaper, the Freelance Star. You all might recognize this as I-95 near Stafford, where I grew up. And this is the norm these days, this type of standstill traffic. Once you hit Stafford, Fredericksburg going north towards DC, this is what traffic looks like. Um, and so when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, majority coming from driving, it's no surprise when we think about highways like I-95 around central and northern Virginia. So these greenhouse gases from the transportation sector are driving these changes to our atmosphere, thus contributing to climate change, which exacerbates these superstorms and other extreme weather events. Ironically, the transportation sector is then having to spend much of its budget on storm repairs. So when we look at VDOT storm costs, for example, these are a couple of headlines I pulled. There is this trade-off. Storm repairs are incredibly expensive, and sometimes they come out of maintenance budgets that are for other items like pothole filling, as we see here. And I pulled one line out of this news article from a little while back, saying VDOT's latest estimate for repairs and response totals $11 million for Florence and $35 million for Michael. So as storms are occurring more frequently, specifically hurricanes, departments of transportation across the nation have to spend more and more of their budgets on repairing the transportation system after storms rip up roads and other infrastructure. So let's look at these big extreme weather disaster events nationwide. So this graph shows billion-dollar disaster events across the US from 1980 up through 2020. And there's a lot to look at here, but basically what we see is that billion-dollar weather disasters are on the rise. If you can find that solid black line, you can see the 5-year average costs, which are clearly rising. And keep in mind that this data is adjusted for consumer price index. And you can see the different colors represent the different types of extreme weather events, such as flooding, winter storm, drought, wildfire, severe storm event, cyclone, etc. So that's the data for the US as a whole. Let's look at Virginia as a state. So this is the same billion-dollar disaster event data just for Virginia. And there's a couple years in here that do have missing data, but you can still see that solid black line that is the 5-year average costs, which are a little bit of a different trend compared to the US as a whole. What's really interesting to note here is that the severe storm count for 2020 is already at 5, which is the highest number for any of the recorded years. And we're only a little over halfway through this year and not really even into the true hurricane season yet. So you see the irony in the transportation sector emitting the greenhouse gases that exacerbate the extreme weather events, which then wreak havoc on that same transportation sector. So it's clear that something needs to change. And it's clear that we need to address the extreme amount of greenhouse gases coming out of the transportation sector. So what's our solution to lower greenhouse gas emissions and change the transportation sector? The obvious one is clean forms of transportation. And there are many different clean forms of transportation, but the one I'm going to focus on today, which you can probably already guess, is greenways. Greenways are sometimes called by other terms, such as multi-use path, shared use path, trail, walking and biking route. No matter what you call it, greenways are a critical piece of the clean transportation solution. And I do want to note that while I'm focusing solely on greenways in this presentation, that doesn't downplay the other forms of clean or low emission transportation that need to go hand in hand with greenways, like transit and electric vehicles. So just keep in mind that greenways are a solution that go hand in hand with other forms of sustainable transportation. And I can't talk about greenways without referencing this slide that I love. This is actually from the New Jersey Greenways Guidebook. And it shows that greenways are not just one of these things, but all three. They are the intersection of transportation, of conservation, and recreation. And the greenway that I'll be using as a model throughout this presentation is, of course, the East Coast Greenway, where I work. So I'll tell you a little more through the next few slides about who we are and what we do. So the East Coast Greenway is a walking and biking route that stretches 3,000 miles from Maine to Florida. Our mission is to connect the population centers along the eastern coast, so both the urban and the rural from north to south. As of last year in 2019, we reached about 1,000 miles of traffic protected trail. So that means we are about 1/3 complete. And so when I say complete or 1,000 miles of traffic protected trail, what we mean by that is traffic separated greenway, a multi-use path that is open for cyclists, walkers, runners, wheelchair users, skaters, sometimes even equestrians, and other different forms of mobility. And the East Coast Greenway is a trail, of course, but it's more than just a trail. It's transportation, as I said before. And it's a gym. People use the Greenway for exercise, whether it's walking, running, walking a dog, pushing a stroller, cycling on a recumbent bike, sometimes even cross-country skiing up in the Northeast, not so much down here in Virginia and North Carolina, but it is a gym. And of course, it's a community center where people of all different walks of life, of all different ages, races, ethnicities can come together. And it's a tourism attraction, good for local business. Businesses along the trail make good money. Property values of houses that are along the East Coast Greenway tend to increase significantly. And the Greenway is a park. We encourage environmental stewardship through open space conservation. So a few quick numbers about the East Coast Greenway. As I said before, it's 3,000 miles long from Maine to Florida. Greenway passes through 15 states and Washington, D.C., passes through 450 different communities, and there are 25 million people within 5 miles of the route. And so notice that 25 million people does not say Greenway users, it says people within 5 miles of the route. So part of our mission is to engage those people who aren't using the Greenway to start using it, to see the Greenway not just as a park or just as a place to recreate, which it is, but also as an actual form of transportation that they can use to commute or to run errands or to get their kids to school. And part of what we do as an organization, as the East Coast Greenway Alliance, is we build partnerships and extend Greenway expertise. Keep in mind these photos were taken before COVID times, so no, we are not doing in-person events right now. And of course, we have a great network of volunteers and other supporters who give time, funding, expertise to help grow and develop the Greenway. So in Virginia, East Coast Greenway has some great highlights, one of which is the Virginia Capitol Trail in Richmond. I'll just go through a few quick highlights to get you familiar if you're not yet. Greenway is routed along the Mount Vernon Trail through Northern Virginia up into DC, as well as the Tobacco Heritage Trail on the south side, and the Dismal Swamp Canal Trail around Chesapeake. So now that you're a bit more familiar with the East Coast Greenway, let's talk about some numbers. Greenway impacts by the numbers. And as we all know, numbers are important, especially when talking to leaders and elected officials in terms of economic impact, public health impacts, environmental impacts. So I'd like to look at a case study that is on the impact of the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle region of North Carolina. And I know we're talking about Virginia in this presentation, but I do think this case study in North Carolina is very applicable to Virginia and other states as well. So this was a study that we had commissioned by Alta Planning and Design with data from North Carolina State University. This was a combination of in-person intercept surveys done on the trail and analysis of past studies and then extrapolating that data. And so when I say the Triangle region of North Carolina, generally that refers to, if you're not familiar, Durham, Raleigh, Chapel Hill area. The East Coast Greenway is routed through Durham and Raleigh, as well as the town of Cary in between the two. So that's the specific region we're talking about in this study. And what I want to highlight is the transportation and environmental benefits of the East Coast Greenway that the consultants found through this study. So we'll start with transportation and access benefits. So again, what the consultants were looking at is how are people using the Greenway and how often are they using it? So over the course of this study, through interviewing folks and through looking at a few other past studies, they found that through the use of the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle region, there were 1.4 million annual fewer miles traveled by car, which is good to know, but again, a lot of what it comes down to is the monetary aspect. So what are the results? That results in huge savings on household vehicle costs, collision-related costs, and congestion-related costs. So again, this is from people choosing to walk or bike or roll in whatever other way on the Greenway rather than getting in the car and driving their car to get somewhere. And then there are health and environmental benefits. So the consultants found that through the presence of the East Coast Greenway in the Triangle, there are over 11 million miles biked per year, over 7 million miles walked per year, which adds up to about 3.5 million annual hours of physical activity. So that's a lot of exercise. And this results in about 1.5 million in annual healthcare cost savings. So to explain that number a bit, that's an estimation of the savings on healthcare costs that would be spent if folks didn't have this resource for maintaining their physical health. So money that would be spent on preventable diseases such as diabetes or heart disease, perhaps. And then, of course, the environmental benefits is 1.1 million pounds annual reduction in CO2 emissions. So again, getting people out of their cars and onto the Greenway to get where they need to go. So these are some exciting numbers. And if you think about it, this is just a small region of North Carolina. You know, there's about this 30-ish mile stretch between Durham and Raleigh, and we're really just looking at that area. And so if you extrapolate these numbers and think about the East Coast Greenway on a state level or on the East Coast level, these numbers would be a lot bigger. And just to note that this impact report is available online. If you go to our website, greenway.org, and go to the North Carolina state page, you can download the report. And that was just one example from North Carolina. These impact studies exist everywhere. Virginia's got a lot of great ones. And these are just a few of the ones I thought about. There's a recent one for the Virginia Capitol Trail. There's an impact of bicycle facilities in the Hampton Roads region. The Virginia Creeper Trail has a great impact study. And there's plenty more from all different types of trails and greenways in Virginia that I would recommend looking into. And again, when we talk about the importance of numbers, this is what makes a difference when talking to elected officials about legislation or funding. These economic impacts, environmental impacts, public health impacts, being able to put a number on the story and not just have it be anecdotal, as we all know is really important. So I've shown a lot of the benefits of greenways, and we all know they're great for public health, and they're great environmentally, but we haven't really delved much into why are greenways one of the key parts of the clean transportation solution. So I'd like to go into a few specifics now. First of all, greenways are resilient. Greenways can handle flooding, for example. It's a lot more okay if the greenway floods than if, for example, a housing complex or a business floods. Flooding and sea level rise will both become more common as climate change continues, and there will be less and less land where we can build houses and businesses. There will be more land where houses once were that can now operate as greenways or parks or other community centers. There are many places, including segments of the East Coast Greenway, where the Greenway was built on FEMA buyout properties, for example. And I do want to address the obvious point that when greenways are flooded, they're not a totally reliable source of transportation. And that's why we advocate for greenways that are built hand in hand with other forms of sustainable transportation, like bus stops, trains, metros, etc., that can operate under bad weather conditions. Secondly, greenways can be part of climate change legislation. You might see a couple of folks you recognize from Virginia in this photo here with the East Coast Greenway sign that they were about to install. So far, greenways and bike and pedestrian infrastructure have not played the role in federal and state level legislation that they could. They have a lot more potential. And so for the next few slides, I want to outline how that might look for greenways and other bike and pedestrian infrastructure to play more of a role in climate change legislation. So let's look at Executive Order 43 to start off with. Governor Northam signed Executive Order 43 back in September of 2019. And we all know this as kind of the clean energy thing. So it's about deploying more clean energy jobs, energy equity, and then of course reducing environmental impact and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so most of the focus for many organizations and in the media is the commitment to renewable energy sources, which is great. But it's also important to note that bike, pedestrian infrastructure, and greenways also fits within the goals of this order. So greenways reduce environmental impact from the transportation sector, and they mitigate the impacts of climate change by offering a zero-emission transportation option that a diverse array of people can take advantage of. So it's rare that you see greenways written into an executive order like this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it is totally feasible to do so. And we need to start taking the steps to see that any type of bike, pedestrian infrastructure can play a huge role in mitigating the impacts of climate change. So there's some other opportunities in Virginia to advance greenways as part of the clean transportation solution. And I'm not an expert on any of these, but I would like to give a quick overview on some of the highlights. If you are involved with Environment Virginia, then you've probably heard of Destination Zero Carbon. Destination Zero Carbon is a nationwide campaign, actually, to electrify cars, electrify buses, and reduce the need to drive by making it easier, cheaper, and more enjoyable to travel on foot, bike, or public transit. So there's about 3 main goals with Destination Zero Carbon, and the third one really applies to greenways. The third goal is double the number of people who travel on foot, bike, or public transit by 2030. And a huge part of doubling that number is building the infrastructure. So it's kind of that if you build it, they will come concept, which we'll touch more on later. But people don't want to use infrastructure that isn't safe or isn't complete. So a big part of that is building out Virginia's greenways, bike lanes, rail trails, etc. The second is the Transportation and Climate Initiative, also known as TCI. So TCI is a regional collaboration of states, as well as Washington, D.C., that seeks to improve transportation, develop the clean energy economy, and reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. And one exciting thing to note is Virginia is the southernmost state to join TCI. So joining a lot of, most of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast states. And TCI kind of has this threefold approach of, as you can see in the figure here, cap pollution, polluters pay, communities benefit. Virginia is also the southernmost state to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. So RGGI is the first mandatory market-based program in the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as many of you know, Virginia just finalized its regulation to establish a market-based program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the opportunity we have here is to make greenway infrastructure the given instead of the exception. It's often thought of that greenways are a special add-on to a project, but what we really need to do is make greenways the norm in cities and towns and rural areas. And we'll get to this more in a minute, but part of the reason for low rates of biking and walking as forms of commuting is that the infrastructure is not there, or it is there and it's insufficient. Greenways haven't been a huge part of the clean transportation solution so far because people don't have the infrastructure they need. So making greenways the norm in cities and towns and rural areas is also how we make greenways a bigger part of the clean transportation solution and how we plug into climate change legislation. And then once we do that, what we have is an opportunity to do with petroleum what we did with coal. So if you look at this graph, energy consumption in the US from 1776 up until about 2019, you can see that black line there represents coal. US consumption of coal peaked in 2005 and has declined about 42% since then. Petroleum, you can see that brown line there, has been the largest source of energy consumption in the US since it surpassed coal in the 1950s. And so what we have, as I said before, is an opportunity to significantly decrease our reliance on petroleum. I'm not saying we're going to stop using petroleum in the US. That will probably never happen. And that's okay. What I am saying is that we have an opportunity to significantly shift into what type of transportation modes we're using to get around, where we don't have to rely on petroleum as extensively as we do right now. But before we do any of that, we have to talk about the barriers to using greenways, because right now it's not feasible to double the rate of biking and walking until we address some of these. So I'm going to cover three big points here. Bike and pedestrian infrastructure and greenways need to be safe, connected, and convenient. Obviously, greenways are not the main form of transportation in Virginia or in the United States right now, and it's worth talking about why not. So let's delve into these. The first is safety. And a quick note before I continue that the data and the figures from these next few slides are from that triangle impact report that I mentioned before. So we'll start on this one with the bad news. The average number of bicyclists and pedestrians killed each year in North Carolina, 193. So that's the bad news. The good news is that shared use paths, like the East Coast Greenway, reduce injury rates and reduce death rates for cyclists, pedestrians, and other non-motorized users by 60% compared with on-street facilities. So what we see here is that on-street facilities or biking and walking on the shoulder of the road doesn't cut it. People need infrastructure like greenways that is traffic protected to keep them safe. Second aspect is connectivity. Greenways need to connect people to the places they go and the resources they use. And until greenways are fully connected, use rates will remain low. So this is some data from the League of American Bicyclists. It's percent of all trips by biking or walking. And I first want to draw your attention to the x-axis here. Don't be tricked into thinking that that goes up to 100%. The max on that x-axis is only 14%. So if you look at walking and biking rates by year, you'll see our maximum here is 12% walking rate for 2017. For biking, it's a lot lower. So we're really seeing that out of all the trips people are making, very few of them are on foot or by bike or other non-motorized use. There's also data from the National Household Travel Survey that shows that out of all biking trips, 59% are less than or equal to a mile. And of all walking trips, 87% are less than or equal to 1 mile. So again, when people are walking and biking, they tend to not go very far. And again, that brings us back to connectivity. It's probably not that people only want to go a half mile. It's probably that they don't have the infrastructure they need to get where they want to go on foot or by bike. So a bit more data from the League of American Bicyclists. They looked at all the different states and the percent of commuters who bike in each state. So percent of commuters who bike for Virginia, 0.41%. Not the lowest out of all the states, I will say that, but not great. The fortunate thing is that there has been a change over time. We can see from 2006, 2017, there was an 89% increase, and then 2011 to 17, 19%. So more people want to do it. That's the good news. But it's true that very few commuters are using biking and walking as their modes of transportation. Why is that? And one big reason, again, is that the Greenway infrastructure is not in place to get people where they need to go. Or it is in place in very select areas, but it doesn't take them outside the cities to the suburbs, for example, in many cases. So this last piece on connectivity, this is a picture I love from Northern Virginia of a metro station. And you can see the bike rack here right next to the metro station, next to the escalator and the elevator. And it has a roof over it to protect you from the rain. So this is that, as I said before, that if you build it, they will come concept. And I would add to that concept, it's not just if you build it, it's if you build it in a way that is safe, accessible, and equitable for all, then they will come. So it's not just about building the infrastructure, it's about building it in the right way that is accessible to all people. And of course, I can't talk about connectivity without talking about the whole mission of the East Coast Greenway again, which is connecting all the population centers along the East Coast. So again, that's our vision, is this connectivity where eventually you can travel completely traffic protected Greenway all the way from Maine to Florida. We're 1/3 of the way there, so we've got a little bit to go. So the last piece is convenience. Greenways need to be easy to use. Greenways that are out in the middle of the woods in rural areas are great and important and should continue to be built. But greenways need to connect to where people live and be easily accessible. So we have to make it easy for people to use a greenway. Plenty of people, myself included, will load up their bike on their car and drive it to a greenway access point. I know I've done that plenty of times before. But it's important that people can get to the greenway from the house without having to use a car in the first place. So we need to make it convenient to get on your bike or walk versus getting in your car. So the good news is, as we can see from this figure here, financially, it's more convenient to operate a bike than a car. We're seeing that the average annual cost of operating a car, a little over $8,000, whereas the average annual cost of operating a bike, a little over $300. I would say that that cost might change a little bit depending on if you have a fancier, nicer bike or not. But either way, it's still a lot cheaper to operate your bike than it is to operate your car. And these numbers are great, and they make it obvious that having a bike is cheaper, but especially for folks who do have a lot of disposable income, it's often still easier to get in the car to go somewhere. And so what we need to do with Greenways is make it just as convenient, if not more convenient, to get on a bike or get on your feet and start walking to get to where you need to go. Which brings us back to the beginning of making greenways safe, connected, and convenient. Making greenways safe and connected in order for them to be convenient is a better way to put that. So once we hit all three, once we make greenways safe, connected, and convenient, many of which already are, but we need to do that on a more universal level, on a statewide level in Virginia as a whole. Once we can hit all three, we can get more people using the greenways. And when more people are using the greenways and other clean forms of transportation, of course, instead of the typical motorized transportation that the large large majority of our population is using, that's when we can take these greenhouse gas emission reductions to a much greater level and really make an impact in combating climate change. So remember, this is the data that I showed earlier from the Triangle Impact Report in North Carolina. And this is just for this one small region of North Carolina. And what we have an opportunity to do is to take these numbers, extrapolate them on a much, much larger scale, and take this 1.14 million pound annual reduction in CO2 emissions and quadruple it, or times 10, times 20, times 30, and really make a significant impact in mitigating the impacts of climate change. And I want to end on this image, reminding us that greenways are not just transportation. I've been talking a lot about clean forms of transportation throughout, but this is a good reminder that greenways are transportation, they are recreation, they are conservation, and they are the intersection of all three and how they work together. So in our efforts to create a clean transportation future, we need to think about greenways in this intersectional way. And with that, I will wrap it up and say thank you so much for watching. I hope that was enjoyable for you. I know it's hard not to be able to do this in person, but if you would like to interact over email or over the phone, whatever, you can email me at sarah@greenway.org. I'm also on Twitter if you want to engage on there. I would be happy to answer any questions and talk further. And thank you so much for being here today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.